Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, welcome to tonight's Parks seminar. Those of you on the screen whom I haven't met, my name's Neil Gregor and I'm Professor of Modern European History here. And it's my enormous pleasure today to welcome back to the University of Southampton our distinguished former student, now gone on to great things, Gavin Schaffer. Gavin has published incredibly widely and with sort of enormous insight across a wide range of 20th century fields. Up until recently, he was Professor of Modern British History at the University of Birmingham. And he's very recently, I think in the last year or so, moved to become Professor of Modern History at Manchester Metropolitan University. Now, the reason we've got him to come back to us is to mark and talk about the publication of this, an unorthodox history, British Jews since 1945, which I've been reading over the last couple of days, and it's a really wonderfully stimulating and enjoyable read, incredibly timely, hopefully very provocative in a productive kind of way. And so it's lovely to have Gavin here just to say a few words about the book in what I think is going to be a short, informal paper.
Sure, it is.
And then we can just see where the discussion takes us. So, Gavin,
Thank you, Neil. And thank you, Neil, for being very kind about the book. It's very sweet. He's a nice man. It's always a pleasure to be here. I like coming back here. It was an incredibly stimulating place to do a PhD, and maybe some of you are doing that now. It was exciting. Everybody, the academics who were on the corridor were so keen to engage. I think we've lost a little bit of that now, in that the corridors are not as vibrant as they were, or at least they weren't in Birmingham, and they're not in Man Met, and there aren't as many people in. And but when I was doing it, it just seemed like that. I just remember thinking it was just extraordinary who was on the corridor, and you had Brian Chayette and Tony and David Cesarani and Mark Rosewood just on the corridor, and just around Nadia Valman, and what a place to do Jewish history, and I'm absolutely sure it still is. So it's always nice to be back. Neil's right. I've just said to him, I've written a short paper, and I think Neil made me sound quite important now, and he's right. I am. One of the many ways in which I'm important is I've just become president of the Jewish Historical Society of England, and one of my first decrees, like Trump, I wrote a series of executive orders on day one, and one of them was that I don't want to see as many long lectures, because I think we've lost the ability to listen to them. And I think I just feel people turning off, and I'm much more comfortable now doing kind of in conversation with, or doing shorter things. And that's what I'm going to do today. And it's not because certainly not because I don't have anything to say about this book. It took me nearly 10 years to write it. It's just that I think as a format, it's not something we should do anymore. And I think we'll probably stop doing it in the classroom fairly soon, because the students will vote with their feet, or, they'll be there, but not really there, if you know what I mean. And I think we might need to think of more innovative ways to talk to each other. Those days of the Parks papers where somebody would come in and you'd be desperately hoping they'd shut up after like an hour and 20 minutes when everybody's long stopped listening. I think those days are numbered. You don't have Parks papers like that anymore. Yeah, you did. I think I gave some of them. Anyway. What I do want to say is I want to try and explain why I wanted to write a Jewish history, a post-war Jewish history, like an unorthodox history. I suppose, like for anybody who does this job, it was because I had a feeling that there was a story that needed to be told that hadn't been told before, or at least I think maybe more realistically, it hadn't been told the way I wanted it to be told. Let's be clear, Jewish history, Jewish studies are very, very vibrant fields. And I think sometimes you need to get your head up beyond the UK to see that. Jewish studies in the UK is a thing, and it's good, it's great. But if you go to AJS in the States, you suddenly see like the enormity of the field and the amount of people working and the exciting things they're doing. So I don't think you can start a project like this and say I wanted to do it because nobody's talking about Jewish history, because that's utter rubbish. But I think it's probably fair enough to say that in this exciting field, not that much attention is given to Britain. What's vibrant at the moment, and yeah, well, what's been vibrant for the last 10, 15 years or so, there's loads of really exciting things being done in Mizrahi studies. There's been the kind of creeping realization that the Jews of the world are not white Ashkenazi, and that has led to like massive scholarly endeavors. There's really exciting things being done in Jewish-Muslim relations. I keep seeing really good things on that. But British Jews, post-war British Jews, no, there hasn't been much. There isn't much, and there may be because it's not that important, but it is to me, and that's why I wanted to write this. And when I'm saying that it's a kind of quiet field, there are noble and notable exceptions, you know, that not least that guy Kushner, is it, who works in this department, has been sort of just doing astounding work for, what were you saying, 35 years now here, something like that here. And not only Tony, but people in the day like David Cesarani and Jeffrey Alderman. And there's a new generation of scholars as well, people like Hannah Ewens, who was here too, Dave D. There are some interesting things going on. And once you come out of history, there's even more. So there's great, there's been some great documentaries and novels, and there's research on the contemporary community. But for me, that kind of post-war space there were gaps, there were silences, not so much because these things hadn't been considered, but because certain approaches and issues had taken hold, which had led scholarship in a specific direction, and one that left me feeling that there was more work to do. I think that the first and most prominent of the approaches that had taken hold relates to an anxiety, a contemporary anxiety within and beyond the community about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is an ever-present concern within Jewish communities. But in recent years, there's been something of an explosion of interest. I think probably triggered by Jeremy Corbyn's period of leading the Labour Party, and kept current amid the ever-present disaster of Israel and Gaza. When I came here in 2000 to do my PhD with Tony, I think we both had the feeling that Jewish history was doing Jewish was a bit parochial. And Tony was giving me advice at the time. Tony always gave good advice, but Tony's advice at the time was like, if you want to get a job, you know, you need to explain why this stuff matters, and maybe make sure that people understand that it sits alongside other migrant histories, other minority histories, that you're not just doing Jewish history for Jewish sake. I think I think he knows as well, that's now changed. You know, there was this explosion of concern about anti-Semitism, and all of a sudden Jews were in the news, and Jewish history and Jewish studies was more of a thing. I got a Leverhulme grant to finish this book. And I've got to be honest, I don't think I would have got it in a different political climate. I think the political climate had convinced our peers that this was something that was worth doing in a way that wasn't the case. But you're signing up then on a certain set of terms. and say that you've got this anxiety about anti-Semitism that is sitting over everything. And scholarship has responded in a clever way, as clever people do, to this new state of affairs. There have been new exciting centres springing up to look at anti-Semitism. Most recently, I think the University of Michigan is opening a new centre on the study of anti-Semitism, which no doubt will become a beacon of good work. And good new books have been written and are being written. And I didn't want to write another one. And that wasn't because I didn't think that anti-Semitism was worth talking about. I do, but because I deeply respect people like David Feldman, who's working on that, Anthony Lerman, who's just written a book on that. And I didn't think that I had much to add. But I think it's also fair to say that I also worry that thinking about Jews in terms of anti-Semitism is stifling. It's not productive. It's not what I want to be doing. I suppose as like a banal observation, that I think it would be a shame if scholarly analysis of Jews and Judaism is reduced to explanations of why people don't like us. I could make the argument that that is what some people in the Jewish community want. I could make the argument that that is what some funders seem to want. It's not what I want. So I think, one example of this is if you look at the wonderful work that's gone on in Glasgow around Garnet Hill Synagogue and the Scottish Jewish Archives Project, Harvey Kaplan and people like that who've just done so much to gather in this extraordinary collection of regional Jewish history, where they've picked up real funding in recent years is when they've agreed to create an exhibition space that looks at the Holocaust. And I think I don't want to be critical of that in any way, shape or form. I just want to observe it, that it's probably easier to get funding for Holocaust stuff and easier to get attention for Holocaust stuff than it is to kind of get attention on, the kind of Scottish migrant journeys that I would like to talk about, and I think that they would like to talk about. And I suppose another example of that would be the scale of funding. That's okay. The scale of funding that the Holocaust Education Trust managed to attract, which I don't want to slag off in any way. I just want to observe it, that it stands in sharp contrast to what you can get for Jewish history. The coffers of the Jewish Historical Society of England are notably smaller. I've spent nearly all of it already. Let's be clear, though, you can't tell the story of post-war Jewry without understanding the impacts of anti-Semitism. I mean, after all, this is a community that grows in the wake of the Holocaust. But I wanted to strive in this book for a different focus. And I also wanted to avoid talking about famous Jews, to avoid getting caught up in a trope about Jews making good of gentrification and success, of Jews as model migrants. And I'm far from being the only person who finds those kinds of stories unsatisfying. Jewish post-war history has far too often been oversimplified into a tale of a gentrifying community on the up, an approach that's neglected working class voices, and that's left people feeling cast adrift amid a suffocating narrative of Jewish success. There was an article in the Jewish Chronicle recently about the kind of silences around the Jewish working class, and there was a woman that they interviewed, and she said, "We are meant to have bettered ourselves, and I haven't," which is, I think we could all have on our gravestones. It's a thing that hangs around your neck, when you've got this narrative of a community on the up. And what about you? What about people who haven't done that? British Jews, we are too frequently told, got on in the post-war, made good, got affluent, all of which is a picture that I don't really recognise. It's not the community I know, and It suppresses what David Cesarani once described as the funny things that happened on the way to the suburbs. You know, it's a complex migrant journey, what's happened to British Jews. It's not well attended to by just talking about a community being middle class. To get a richer, to get a more varied understanding of Jewry, you need to dig outside of this story, I think, and that means digging outside of London. You need to look at the diverse roads travelled by British Jews. You need to look at the real sprawl of British Jewry, and that's what I wanted to do and what I've tried to do in this book. And finally, I had a real desire to get away from what Salah Baron would have described as a lachrymose Jewish history. When I came here, Elisa Miles was writing a thesis on the lachrymose and Salah Baron. It was a good piece of work. It's been on my mind for the 25 years since that actually this is not a good way to approach Jewish history. You know, weepy tales about death of communities, about endings, and Jewish people and other people too seem too often to dwell amid those kind of lachrymose stories. For me, Dora Horn made me laugh and hit the nail on the head with her "people love dead Jews" analysis, and living ones not so much. I think that was nicely observed. It's not just, though, what other people write about us. Ravidowitz's observation that Jews present as an ever-dying people highlights the problem. We have this extraordinary tendency to always see ourselves as the last link in the chain, the last generation. So why? I think last Jew stories are really seductive. And there are so many of them. You know, go Google it. The last Jew of here, the last Jew of there. It's really, really a thing. But I think that the picture that grows from stories like that diverts us from what's really happening across Jewish communities. And in this time, I would like to just give a few examples of that. And the first concerns my friend and collaborator Nusrat Afsa, and specifically her Kahila exhibition. And Kahila was a set of beautiful photographs of the Reformed Jewish community of Bradford. One of them. So I passed the test of being able to click the first slide. The Kahila photographs as a collection, Nusrat's got a book coming out in the summer, a collection of the photographs, which is going to be a wonderful book. And it's been supported by the Jewish Historical Society of England, and I'm really pleased we have, because it's a wonderful collection of photographs. She's a very talented person, is Nusrat. So she's a Bradford photographer. She works out of Bradford, and I was drawn there, and I was drawn to her when I saw stories about Kahila in the Guardian, and we've been friends since then. So how did Nusrat Afsa end up taking photos of the Jews of Bradford? Well, she had Jewish friends. She found out just in kind of Bradford community that the house she lived in used to be owned by a Jewish family. She became friends with Faye Cramleth, the woman who used to live in her house. They became mates. And one day, one of these friends asked her if she would give them a lift to the Orthodox synagogue in town, because they told Nusrat it was going to be the last service, and this older lady wanted to go to this last service, so Nusrat took her. Nusrat's a social documentary photographer, and she couldn't resist. Right, if this building is going out of use, I want to take photos of it. I want to capture it while it's still here, and that's what she did. And there was a set of photographs of the Bradford Orthodox community as it closed down. And then she got to thinking, well, you know, what about, we've still got a synagogue in the town. There's still a vibrant Reform synagogue in the town. What about if I go and take photos of the living Jewish community? And that's what Kahila is. So Afsa's Kahila is really beautiful, grainy, natural shots taken on fast film to compensate for low light in the synagogue building. those of you who are into this sort of thing won't need me to tell you that you can't take photographs in a synagogue on the Sabbath, but you can in Bradford Reform Synagogue. The rabbi let her, as long as she stayed out the way, she said. And so we see here an old man. This is Rudy Lever, since passed away, 93 then, poised over his prayer book. It looks like he's wearing tefillin. He's not wearing tefillin. He's wearing a little camera on his head, a little light on his head so he can see his prayer book. We see here a woman in the dark blowing out candles on a menorah like it's the last action of a generation. The project, to Afsa's mind, documented a culture that's disappearing, a community that's disappearing. The Reform Synagogue in Bradford opened in 1881, some 50 years after Jews came to the city, and it is indeed in serious decline. When Rudy Lever died in 2021, he was the last of 12 singers in the synagogue's choir, and it's a community that now only gathers around 15 people for monthly services. Money from friends of the synagogue, money notably from the local Muslim, local supporters from the Muslim community, and money from the HLF enabled Bradford Reform to avoid closure in 2013. And as Rudy told the gathered crowd at the opening of the Kahila exhibition in 2020, we just about now tick over in slow motion. Now, for Nusrat Afsa, that idea, this ticking over in slow motion, something that was glorious and is now just hanging on, that's a Bradford story more generally. She told me, I've been in Bradford for a long time. I saw it being kind of vandalized and destroyed in the 60s, although I was young and I didn't understand. And then again, it happened in the 80s. But for many visitors to Kahila, and in much of the press, the story of decline was specifically Jewish, and the Bradford setting recedes. In the exhibition's comment books, visitors recorded feelings that Kahila was, quote, a fine tribute to a lost world, a priceless record of a disappearing way of life, a bygone age. I'm glad to see it before it disappears for good. Meanwhile, it's still there, just about. My next and last story about this decline stuff is about Merthyr Tydfil in the valleys of South Wales. Merthyr was once, by a long way, the biggest Jewish community in Wales. Jews and everybody else were drawn towards Merthyr as part of the Industrial Revolution. It's a huge industrial revolution, boom town. But in the post-war period, the community declined. In 1989, Chaim Bermant's article in the Jewish Chronicle called Last Jews of the Valleys, I told you there were a lot of these Last Jews things, captured neatly the affection and attention given to these Jewish communities, which in Bermant's words were fading away. The story explained that while Jews used to be everywhere in South Wales, where there was once almost a minion of rabbis and shochatim and chazanim, now the rabbi is all on his own. A week later, Bermant was criticised in the Jewish Chronicle for an analysis that sounded, quote, ominously like an epitaph. Their epitaphs were the order of the day, nowhere more so than in the coverage of the end of Jewish Merthyr. The community was portrayed in a 1997 Sunday Telegraph article, also a radio programme, by Tony Scotland entitled The Last Jew of Merthyr. Scotland's narrative focused on a barber, Georgie Black. I've got a picture of him here. Slightly harsh, but there you are. And George Black, when in 1997, when this is written, when Last Jew of Merthyr was written, is in the process. He's retired to Manchester, and the story is this is the last Jew of the town, and he's leaving, and he's off to Manchester. So here again, Jewish history was caught in its last act. as Black told Tony Scotland that he would return to Merthyr only to be buried in the Jewish cemetery. And as you can see, he was good to his word. Black said, yes, I've played for my plot up at the cemetery. I don't know when. That's the only phone call I haven't made. Anybody know Merthyr? You know a bit? So the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Merthyr, where my great grandparents are there, it's in a place called Kefn Coed. It's in the Brecon Beacons National Park. I would thoroughly recommend it as a place to be buried. It's very, very beautiful. Slightly windy. Oh, that's where Georgie Black is. And anyway, we digress. Merthyr is having something of an extremely exciting Jewish afterlife. As some of you might be aware, the Foundation for Jewish Heritage has bought the old synagogue building, which I think I can show you. Let's go on. Yeah, there it is in the middle there, which is this extraordinary Gothic 19th century building. If you're interested, if Welsh synagogues is your thing, Kai Parry Jones is the person to go to. Ursula Enriquez as well, and Sharman Kaddish, but Kai Parry Jones' work on Welsh synagogues is really good. But anyway, this old Gothic synagogue, and the Foundation for Jewish Heritage are in the process of fundraising to turn it into a Welsh Jewish museum, or a museum to the Jews of Wales. Now, I am all in favour of this because, as I have already told you, my grandma was from Merthyr Tydfil. I had a lot of family from there. That was her synagogue, and my dad lived there too. So it's good. You know, I'm excited by the Merthyr project. Whether or not the project is a good idea is a bit of a bigger question. A more cynical person than myself might ask that if the Jewish community can't make a Jewish museum work in Camden Town, are they going to be able to make it work in Merthyr Tydfil? But that's a question for another day. The point that I want to make is that the whole premise of the last Jew of Merthyr is just utter nonsense. It's nonsense. Jews live in Merthyr today. Check the census. There has never been a time when Jews haven't lived in Merthyr. Now, I accept that this isn't really a historical question at all. Are there Jews in Merthyr? But I wanted to explore it nonetheless. So when I was writing the book, I went to the town and I started asking questions. I have an ex-PhD student, a very nice woman called Julie Davis, who comes from Merthyr, who was living in Merthyr. I said to her, Julie, can you find me some Jews? Go home and find me some Jews. I met a really lovely local historian called Chris Clifford, who's writing a book about the synagogue building. Chris, can you find me some Jews? Not an unproblematic question. But lo and behold, Georgie Black was not the last Jew of Merthyr. It is what I've called in my chapter a bit of a Bubbermeister, a bit of a grandma's tale. Never mind the fact, if, you know, for those of you who are sharp-eyed, that Georgie's wife was buried at the cemetery some years after him. Both Julie Davis and Chris Clifford found me Jewish people in the town who considered themselves Jewish, who've been there all along. In Chris Clifford's case, a brother and sister called Steve Shipman and his sister Jackie, and there he is. Steve Shipman has never left Merthyr in his life. He's the child of a Jewish dad, Alf, and a non-Jewish woman, Betty, from down the road in Aberconade. And Steve was really keen to talk about his Jewish heritage, of his grandma's shop, where his parents met, and that's it. And of the complexities of the numerous Jewish lives that were evolving in the town. And he told me a story that made me laugh. Just prior to the pandemic, as Jewish history in the town was coming to assume greater public attention, a local historian was leading a walking tour of vanished Jewish Merthyr. Keen to visit the memorial to victims of the Holocaust, which is outside Merthyr's Central Library, which is an interesting place. So there's this walking tour, vanished Jewish Merthyr, walking through the town. And Steve Shipman sees it, and out in the street, he puts up his hand and he starts shouting at the tour. The historian didn't know, Steve complained, and I quote now, about our family. And it wasn't just our family. Keen to offer a more nuanced immigrant history, he ended up leading the crowd in an impromptu tour of Merthyr's multicultural past and present. And there's the thing about Jewish history. It's not dead. It keeps speaking out of turn. And the story it tells is of a history that's evolving, not dying. Let me extend the example. What you can see in this picture, by the way, alongside the shul in the middle, is that I got to go inside. They had an open day as part of the restoration project. So you can see inside, this is a group of local people looking through the plans for the restoration, and a nice old window that still has the Star of David there. But anyway, to make this museum work, if they're going to make it work, they're going to need to fill it with Jewish stuff, right? That's what you have to do with archives, museums. You've got to fill them with stuff. Now, the Ark of the old synagogue, they want to restore the synagogue. Good. The Ark of the old synagogue can't be recovered. And it can't be recovered because it was donated to Gateshead, where some of you might know it's a big center of very religious Jewish life. There's a big kollel and yeshiva, a big center of Jewish learning up in the northeast, and they will have used this stuff when it was donated to them, and it's probably a bit battered and broken since it was donated in the 1980s. There is no prospect of getting the Ark back from Gateshead. So, no worries. The Foundation Project have sourced another Ark from the recently closed Langside Synagogue in Glasgow. There it is. Which is all well and good. Welsh history, Jewish history, Scottish history. Let's not get bogged down in the detail. Only there is a bit of scandal around the closing of Langside Synagogue too. Because in Langside, a queer diasporist collective, labelling themselves, as you would, Iron Jew, wanted to take over the synagogue when it closed. But they failed to do a deal. They failed to secure a deal to do so. I think the problem is that queer diasporist collectives are not well placed to kind of do business deals to take over synagogues, and they couldn't do the business to actually get it done. But it became a bit of a scandal. They wanted in, they couldn't get in. The synagogue building just closed and was turned into flats, I believe. And Iron Jew had to worship elsewhere. And that's the story I want to tell you, see, because an Ark, which could now be an everyday part of Jewish life and Jewish worship on a current community, is instead to take its place as an item of questionable provenance in a museum. People love dead Jews, living Jews not so much. So what's going on here? I promised you a short paper, so I'm not going to talk for much longer. I think one issue relates to the sort of overwhelming history of the Holocaust and the way that the Holocaust history overwhelms Jewish experience. So if I can explain what I mean, if you're interested in the Foundation for Jewish Heritage, if you have a look at it, 14 of the 18 synagogues, to my eye, that they're working on restoration, they work across Europe. And 14 of the 18 synagogues are Holocaust recovery projects. Same goes for the cemeteries that they work with. And I think when you're doing that amount of Holocaust work, it's difficult to change the lens. But Britain, with its own rotten history of anti-Semitism that was so well exposed by what were described in the 1980s as new historians, Kushner, says Rani, and Martin Gilbert, Britain is a different story. Here, Jewish life evolves, sprawls, is vibrant, and locking into a European Holocaust history lens gets the story badly wrong. What I mean is that I don't think organisations like the Foundation for Jewish Heritage can see Jewish history outside of this European recovery project. The organisation exists primarily to find the remnants of Jewish lives that were destroyed by the Nazis. And on this basis, a derelict synagogue in a town without Jews takes on a completely different meaning to what I would argue is appropriate in the Welsh valleys. If you walk around Merthyr, the town is full of unbelievably beautiful, derelict 19th century buildings, because this town was super, super wealthy and is now one of the poorest places in Britain. It tells a story of decline. It tells a story of Thatcherism. It tells a story of the end of Britain as an industrial powerhouse, of poverty, of neglect. But it tells you not very much specifically about British Jews, aside from the fact that British Jews are, of course, part of that story. So why regenerate the synagogue? Amid so much broader neglect, what is the message? Ditto in Bradford, where it's a very similar story. Why wade in as a foundation? Why wade in as a local Muslim community and save a synagogue when around there are hundreds of similarly worthy projects? What I want to do is to say we really need to talk about this. I don't think it's wrong or bad or anything like that. I just think it's interesting. Within 100 yards of the synagogue in Merthyr, there are 2 or 3 buildings equally deserving of massive effort of regeneration and getting nothing, going nowhere. What is it about the kind of dead and dying Jewish community that attracts so much interest? Why is it important to the Muslim population of Bradford that it doesn't go? Interesting question. So, just lost my place. Couldn't do that with paper, you know. Well, another reason I've argued why the Jewish community is becoming keen on this kind of preservation is that it's maybe less scary than engaging with the present. Because if Jewish lives are not declining, and I argue that they are not, the kind of Jewish lives that are evolving will be considered by many Jews beyond the pale, not really Jewish at all. If Jews of the future are secular, are progressive, queer, have married non-Jews, are members of queer diasporist collectives, some, perhaps many, will prefer a lost Jew story to this new chapter. But you don't have a choice, you see, because the new chapter this is. Because the Jews of Merthyr and Bradford are alive and well. They just live in Boreham Wood and Golders Green and New York. Their story in terms of changing cultures of religiosity, migration, identity, is a core and embedded part of multicultural British history. British Jews are in with the bricks. Jewish experiences and lives are British histories. They're here for good. Writing in the shadow of the Third Reich, Cecil Roth asserted, the historian, deprive modern Europe and America of its Hebraic heritage, and the result would be barely recognizable. It would be it would be a poorer thing. It's in this spirit that I've written an unorthodox history. Focused consciously on the community's margins, it tries to offer at least a few of the stories about how we got here from there. And in the end, it is a story of a community that's doing okay, that still largely recognizes itself, that is a very, very long way from taking its last stand. To the British Jewish author Louis Golding, Judaism was, quote, a radioactive core which gives off countless particles of energy, yet remains unexhausted and inexhaustible. Still energetic and meaningful to many, British Jewry is indeed unexhausted, sparking and shaping the multicultural nation that has become its home for good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gavin, for a wonderfully wide-ranging talk that picks up a lot of themes in a sort of characteristically provocative manner, revisionist in a kind of intensely interesting way. So let me just throw the floor open to questions, either from the floor or from online. Sue Lieberman, you've got a hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself? And
yeah, can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you. Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gavin. That was a very interesting talk and very stimulating. I kind of less from a question, more the sort of dialogic thing. So I really am so sympathetic to your general thesis. I am retired now, but I worked as a psychotherapist, and I've written about British Jews' kind of emotional responses to the Holocaust, and it's totally puzzling to me in certain ways why so many of the people I know professionally, so Jewish psychotherapists, still labour under this lachrymose view, and see everything in terms of pogroms and anti-Semitism, and it's bizarre. I mean, I live in Edinburgh. Most of the folk I know live in London, but it's still, the narrative seems really quite fixed, and I kind of have to think a lot about why that is, because people don't want to even psychotherapists, you'd have thought they would be interested in widening their perspectives. They don't want to think about whether there may be a different way of looking at this. And I haven't got so far in my thinking, but part of my thesis is, because of my own research, is that since most of us are descended from immigrants from late 19th century, early 20th century Tsarist Russia, there's a whole kind of unspoken narrative and history that goes with being an immigrant. Our kind of grandparents, great-grandparents were immigrants in an era where you couldn't really talk about such things. And that's contexted in the massive loss that then took place in Europe. And I suspect that's maybe linked to why a Muslim woman, like the woman who took the photos in Bradford, is kind of really sympathetic, because they share those narratives.
Yeah, I'm sure that's thank you very much. I'm sure that's absolutely right. And I'm sure you're right also about the kind of broader sort of impact of those sort of immigrant histories in shaping the way Jewish people understand themselves and are understood by other people. I don't want to argue in the book that people are wrong. It's really important to say, I don't think people are wrong to be worried about anti-Semitism. I think that would be a very complacent and stupid thing to say. I think what I want to think about is that the impact that anti-Semitism has on the way we think about and construct ourselves. And that's a slightly different thing. I do think that, especially at the moment, the level of anxiety in the community is really sad. It's disturbing and it's sad. I lurk on a huge number of Facebook groups of Jewish community, and I just lurk and I read and I feel sad. And the thing that I invariably feel sad about is how worried people are. When new colleagues come to Birmingham, where I live, there are numerous conversations about whether it's okay to hang a mezuzah on your door. Is it dangerous? Am I identifying myself as a likely victim of anti-Semitic attack? I really, really, really believe that there's nothing to worry about in that respect. And maybe that's complacent and maybe that's wrong, but I've got a big mezuzah on my door and I live in a very mixed neighborhood and I feel okay. But I think we need to acknowledge that an awful lot of people don't. And that's something we need to think about. But thank you, Sue. Can I answer Jay Prosser's question?
Yeah, let me just read
Do
it
you want
out.
to read it out?
I suppose people can see
They
it,
can see it.
but yeah, so thank you for the quote from Cecil Roth, one of Gavin's predecessors as chair of JHSC, of course. Fascinating talk, Gavin, but a big absence is the Orthodox, who I believe are the fastest growing UK Jewish demographic. Is there a place for them in your book? If not, why not?
Thank you for your question, Jay. Yes, they are in the book. Of course, they are. The book is unorthodox. If it's unorthodox at all, it's unorthodox in the approach it takes to Jewish history. It is not about the fact that it deals solely with unorthodox people. There's a chapter in the book called Meshuggah Frum, where I talk about the idea that Jewish communities have been perceived as pulling apart, so that you've got this religious communities which I've generally defined not in a particularly original way as sort of being right of the united synagogue. Not just what some people would call ultra-Orthodox communities, but a whole set of communities that are very, very religious. And you're quite right, Jay, that those communities are expanding. But what's also expanded in the post-war enormously is the growth of progressive British Judaism. So you've got these poles that are ostensibly growing apart, and yet the argument that I make in Meshuggah Frum is that actually both these very seemingly different expressions of Jewish life have an awful lot in common, and more in common than they often like to think, even as so that when people throw accusations at each other like "you're not proper Jews," they're nasty words, but they're words that are meant to be still meant to articulate an argument within one community. So yeah, they are in the book. I think it would have been a very big mistake to leave Orthodox Jews out of the book.
Anushka?
Thanks so much. I really liked the idea that the reason why there's so much attention on heritage is that it's much easier to think about preserving the shore than thinking about the future of the community. And like just yesterday, I was talking with friends about how this anxiety about saving the community and saving the legacy of it means that actually more people are pushed away when they're trying to marry same sex or reform Masorti or Masorti in a synagogue and they're not allowed to, and how it's a kind of self attack in a way. So I really liked that was your hypothesis. But my question was more, I saw your book excitingly in foils in Waterloo Station. I was like, whoa, that's like an academic book in foils. And I was wondering about whether that was your decision.
You didn't take a photo, did you? I'd have liked to have seen. So does we are.
Was it your decision for it to be trade, and how was it received
By
the community or like in academic circles?
I don't know. It was my decision for it to be trade. I think so. I've done 2 books before that, and they both got nice reviews in academic journals. But I was left with the distinct feeling that nobody read them, really. And what used to annoy me particularly, as I said this to Neil casually on the way up, was the idea that I felt that the publishers weren't even trying to sell them. That there wasn't even an attempt being made to sell them, and I didn't really want that. Again, I think, I don't know how this book will be received, but it seemed to me that it would have been really negative to do. It took me nearly 10 years, and then to just hide it. So I am pleased that it's on sale. I did deliberately do it like that, but I would say one more thing, which is that, and this might just be me, but I suspect it isn't. It sounds a bit pretentious, this, so forgive it or don't, but I haven't changed my process at all. So I didn't do anything differently to the way I researched the previous two books. MUP didn't ask me to take out the footnotes. They didn't ask me to dumb it down. There was nothing like that. So in a way, all that's actually happened is that it's been sold a bit more aggressively, which I'm really pleased about.
Can I just pick up on the point about heritage? Because obviously, you know, running through the whole book is a sort of sense that this is a Jewish story, but it's also a story that you can tell of other minorities, and it's also a story of post-war Britain more generally. I was sat there, you know, listening to you talk about Merthyr and, you know, the alleged decline of the Jewish community, and I was thinking, well, to be honest, yeah, most things about Merthyr decline. Right. Okay. You know, when I sort of drive over to the Rwanda, you know, you see Merthyr and you kind of accelerate, right? You want to go past. It's not somewhere to stop. And you know, that kind of, but that turn to heritage is also not a peculiarly Jewish thing in the sort of 90s onwards, right? I mean, nostalgia, if you like, is a sort of cultural mood that's out there more generally. So I'm trying to sort of reach for what's a peculiarly kind of Jewish sort of dimension to this. And I was just wondering, reading your book, really, that if kind of, you know, religion is not got quite that hold that it had on previous generations, just as is true in the, you know, in the Christian communities. If we're sort of slightly icky about languages of race these days, and we're even still a bit kind of suspicious of the language of sort of the ethnic or tribes, and you know, if Israel has become kind of, you know, not something that necessarily you know, enables all Jews to agree either, then heritage is actually kind of something that you can reach for.
Yeah, right.
And I don't think that's necessarily a kind of a bad thing.
No, I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just that everything I say sounds like I think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I just think it's a thing, and it just needs to be observed. So, like, if you look at the book, if you look at the way that the book's structured, there's loads of stories in the book, and basically you could boil them down to ways to be Jewish when you don't want to pray anymore. And you know, there's stuff about Zionist activism works in a very similar way. The campaign for Soviet Jewry works in a very similar way. Opposition to missionary activity works in a similar way. To use the words of Harvey Kaplan, who the Scottish archive activist, who my friend and who I interviewed, it gives people a way to plug in. And he's right about that. People are looking for a way to plug in. And Heritage, Neil, you're absolutely right, is one of those things. Yet, look at Merthyr. It is this project that's got money. And I don't, you know, we've got to be really careful with this, because my shtick is not, oh, look, Jews are good at getting money. Like, you know, God forbid that's the kind of nonsense that I was talking. But it's just interesting to me that certain projects are being valued and certain projects are not. You know, in many ways, the Welsh Jewish Project is a lovely project. It's my grandma's shawl. It's a wonderful project. But wow, how are we funding that when we're not funding X, Y, and Z? And how's this going to work? I mean, I just think that these are questions that need entertaining. In 1967, when the Arab-Israeli War was taking place, there's a nice letter in the Scottish press of a guy who's really, really angry that 1,000 people turn up to a rally in Glasgow in support of the Israeli state, and they can't get a minyan to have a synagogue service. And it's like, there's a story here, there's something going on. You know, you can't get enough people to go to shul, but you can get people to be Jewish in a different way. And this is the sprawl of that, isn't it?
Got another question online from Rachel Blumenthal. Does your book talk about the community of ex-Israelis who live in the UK?
Yeah, honestly, Rachel, not really. There's a lot of stuff in the book about British. There's a lot of stuff in the book about British Jews who go to Israel. So one of the things that that initially sparked my attention in this project was I like the idea of working on I like the idea of thinking through the lives of those 40,000 British Jews who had up sticks and moved to Israel in their parlance, in Zionist parlance, who had made Aliyah and gone to live kind of ideological lives in Israel. And obviously some of these lives are more ideological than others. If you read the historiography of migration to Israel works much more like migration to every other country, as you might suspect it would. But I got really interested in these particularly ideologically fervent youth club volunteers from organizations like movements like Habonim, Hashem Hatzair, B'nai Akiva, who went and established actual communities in Israel. And I went over there and interviewed a lot of British Jews who'd moved to Israel. So that's in the book, but there isn't a lot of stuff about Israelis that have moved here. I'm sorry, because that would be interesting.
Any more questions?
Charles,
Charles?
was that a choice, or was that just a kind of?
The Israelis in Britain. I didn't really think about it. I think I have conceptualized. I think it would be fair to criticize the book that obviously, like, I've conceptualized British Jewry in a particular way, and there are a lot of Israelis that have moved in Britain, and it just wasn't on my mind. So no, there was no good reason for that. There's a reason, but there's no good reason.
Kendra?
This is not really, I don't know whether it's a question. I'm just sort of wondering about the sort of spaces and the places that serve as the, like, where is Jewishness, British Jewishness kind of clustered and centered? It's no longer like the synagogue, or it's not, we don't, like the museum is a problematic space. I mean, I'm thinking about sort of foodways and culture beyond heritage, and I mean, maybe even like readership of the Jewish Chronicle, whatever, like what are the things that in Britain are the kind of repositories of this more diffuse?
So there are plenty of there are lots of different answers to that question. There are. You're talking about inclusivity. Something like the Limud Festival is really interesting. So Limud is a kind of educational event that gathers in a largely non-judgmental way anybody who wants to work on kind of Jewish studies across a framework. And it's amazing. If you go to that conference, they do it. There's lots of little satellite ones, but the big one is usually around Christmas. You'd be amazed at how many people there are there and how vibrant that is. And yes, it is a particular type of British Jew, think me and Kushner and people like that, but it is a very vibrant thing. Ultra-Orthodox or very religious communities, as Jay points out, still very, very vibrant. And then the rest is I would argue it's a really wide-ranging sprawl. So that there was I kind of read the Jewish Chronicle because I feel that's part of my job, and there was a nice row in there probably about a year ago of somebody who attempted a bit of a last Jew or only Jew in Cornwall argument. I mean, can you imagine what Mark Stoll would have to say about that? He'd have been fuming with this. But I mean, what was interesting was that it just triggered a whole wave of people writing in and going, shut up, you don't know what we're talking about. We're here. And all of a sudden you see this network of communities that are just existing in a very kind of comfortable sort of everyday way, whilst other people write them off. So the answer to your question is that British Judaism is everywhere. Even in Merthyr, it's everywhere. There's nowhere in Britain that doesn't have Jewish people. The concentration clusters, I mean, if is Northwest London, but that's only a small part of a broader story.
Can I just add on the word is that maybe it's more in recent years since I've started going as well, but there's a whole new trend of how to engage young British Jews from across the UK, and like Limud does it. There are like we're friendly club nights and like vegan farms and soccer clubs, and like there's a real way of there's like a massive push, and it's successful, of getting British Jews to feel their Jewishness in ways that is not about shul and Friday night dinner with their families, and it works really well, and it's sometimes political, but not always. And so I think it would be interesting to see like how that maps in 10 years or what happens after that.
Yeah.
That's really, yeah.
So I mean, I think that also resonates. I think I'm sure that's right, and it resonates with sort of like if you read the chapter in the book about the kind of queer Jewish lives and sort of and the Israel critical Jews who feel that they're not treated brilliantly in the rest of the community. That's a bit of an understatement. You know, people who feel alienated by the community, and what they tend to do is set up their own, and they set up their own Jewish spaces and different Jewish spaces and go for it. And you see a lot of those. And obviously the nicest example from this lecture would be Iron Jew, you know, not capable of successfully doing a business transfer of Langside Synagogue, but capable of all kinds of other exciting things, I'm sure. Beyond the grave, Tony Kushner has his hand up.
Tony, rumours of Tony's demise are overstated, it appears. Tony.
Hi, yes, I've got to put on my worst accent now to prove that I'm not well, which I'm not. Thank you very much. Could I just ask you, say a bit more about, you were talking about progressive Jews and very Orthodox Jews being sort of mirror images, but the language they can use about each other can often be the language of anti-Semitism. And is that not really in the same family? That you can say all sorts of things about your family, but there's certain things you don't say. And that there are.
But I think that would be a perfectly reasonable argument. I mean, so the chapter of the Meshuggah from chapter opens on an argument between Cyril Harris, an Orthodox rabbi, and Hugo Gryn, on who was one of Britain's most prominent Reform rabbis, and it's an argument on a show called "You Don't Have to Be Jewish" by Michael Friedland, a radio show. And basically, this argument you can hear it on BBC Sounds. If you like a massive row, have a listen. It is absolutely vicious, and the accusations are horrible. So Cyril Harris, who I think you told me, Tony, was in many ways quite a peaceful, progressive figure. Are you nodding? No. I don't know, that may not have been you. But I don't know whether he can see, he's well enough to nod. Anyway, he basically tells Hugo Gryn on radio that the Reform converts don't know the difference between an Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and a swastika. You know, and obviously Hugo Gryn, a Holocaust survivor, absolutely freaks. And so it's like, well, you know, this is a horrible thing to say. He's racist. He accused him then he accuses Harris of being like the Ayatollah. I mean, you know, it's all kicking off. And Kushner's question is really, well, is this the kind of argument you have in the family? And maybe it's my own family, but I think it is. You know, I think it's interesting. If you look at the chief rabbi's reaction, and at that point, it was Jacobovitz, Chief Rabbi Jacobovitz. Jacobovitz tries to play it down, and he says that, you know, if you look at the way that the Hasidic Jews fight in New York, this is nothing. You know, this is, you know, it's low key, and it's not nothing. It's a very serious reflection of the fact that Orthodox Jews delegitimize progressive Jews, but I think it's an argument within the family. I really do. And I think that that's the tone. That you could take the opposite view, and lots of historians of Jewish religiosity have. But I think what I see is the commonality of concern. So if you look at after the Second World War, progressive Judaism knows that it has to restore its rabbinate that's been decimated in the Holocaust. So it opens Leo Baeck College in London to do that. The ultra-Orthodox do the same and start opening new seminaries. If you look at the arguments around the preservation of why they're doing what they're doing, they're incredibly similar about protecting the next generation. They just have a radically different view on how you do it. So to the ultra-Orthodox, to the very Orthodox, you do it by sticking to the rules and sticking to by that. that formula that has lasted hundreds, thousands of years in their perception. And to the progressive, you have to do what you're saying and change the rules and create more inclusive spaces. But there are, but Lionel Blue says you're answering this, you're asking yourselves the same question. And the fact that you're asking yourself the same question, it highlights to me the fact that this is one community. You're still having an argument in the family. It's just a very unpleasant argument. But, you know, I say, listen to that discussion yourself. You won't forget it. It's extraordinary. To go back to my previous project, it's the quality of local radio you don't get anymore. But that's not this project.
Are there any more questions? Well, I don't think I can let you go without picking you up on what I think was a bit of a gentle moan, if I understood you correctly, about overwhelming Holocaust history, as you put it. I mean, I get that, you know, one can express a certain frustration that the kind of scholarly work you might do on the Holocaust might sort of, you know, bulldoze over certain other kinds of interesting history about histories of Jewish history and culture in this country and elsewhere. And yet at the same time, it seems to me the condition of being Jewish after 1945 is shaped, I would think, rather kind of, you know, obviously or profoundly by the historical fact of the Holocaust, whether you are in Poland or Germany or whether you're in Britain. And without the presence of that story, pretty much everything that one reads in your book about, say, how a minoritized faith group deals with queerness, or sort of arguments between conservative and liberal theologians, as you've just been describing, or people who marry out, you know, people who live in the provinces rather than in the kind of, you know, this is a book you could write about British Muslims.
Yeah.
Sort of, Chandler's Ford has a Jewish community, it has a Muslim community. It's just not Bradford, it's not London, right? So your argument about the provinces makes sense, but in a sense, but I suppose what I'm asking is where does the historical fact of the Holocaust sort of sit within your story of post-war British Jewry?
It's a good question. The Holocaust lurks in everything. It lurks in every chapter, this is a traumatized community. You know, it's a traumatized community working through this history, and even though you know, aside from the Channel Islands or whatever, and then aside from the refugees, the few refugees that Britain takes, this is not a directly affected Holocaust community. Of course, it lurks in everything we think post-war, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. It's perfectly reasonable to call that out. I mean, I think it was Miriam Margulies who said that, you know, she's made some remarkable comment that she can't see a train without thinking about the Holocaust. That's not how I see trains, but I get it. And it's like, you know, it lurks. And if you look at the sort of post-war work of some of the novelists, people like Howard Jacobson, you see it lurks in everything. And I think it would be very foolish to deny that. I mean, that is probably changing now, it is probably reducing, but in those post-war decades, how could that community think about much else? I think if we were at the AJS in America, there would be a series of hands now who point out that is quite an Ashkenazi approach to Jewish history, but the British Jewish community is quite Ashkenazi. So yeah, I mean, it lurks everywhere.
Right, well, on that note, we have in the comments from Tony, thank you, Gavin, from perhaps the last Jew in Portswood. We hope not. It'd be a sad.
I'll phone the Jewish Chronicle. I'll have them round at your house next week, for an interview.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank Gavin for, you know, yet another wonderful talk. Always a great value to listen to Gavin. It's always It's delivered in a very kind of easy manner, but there's an awful lot of thought and wisdom underpinning Gavin's talks always. So thanks very much, Gavin, and go out and buy his marvellous book.
In foils.
One for yourself, one for a friend. Okay, it's the perfect gift for that awkward aunt or uncle. You don't know who to buy it for.
Oh.